Opening the flank like this immediately challenges black's central ambitions. Developing a knight to the center immediately challenges white's queenside pawn structure and prepares for further queenside expansion. Developing the knight to c3 solidifies central control and prepares for potential pawn advances, setting up a dynamic skirmish. Prioritizing central pawn control and opening lines for the bishop, this move sets a solid, flexible foundation. Boldly staking central territory, white immediately contests black's knight's preferred influence and prepares to deploy more pieces. Pinning the knight here offers immediate tactical threats and challenges white's central ambitions by creating a potential fork. Pawns now form a solid central pawn triangle, aiming to solidify white's territorial claims and restrict black's bishop. Securing the king's safety with this castling maneuver is a prudent priority, allowing pieces to develop freely. Developing the bishop to its most active diagonal, this piece prepares to exert influence over the center and potentially support a queenside expansion. Asserting central dominion, black ignites the pawn chain's kinetic potential, aiming to unravel white's poised structure through a pawn thrust. Challenging black's bishop forces a decision, potentially opening lines or gaining tempo for white's development. Sacrificing the bishop here, black opens up the queenside pawn structure and aims to disrupt white's harmonious development. Doubling pawns opens a central file, but weakens your pawn structure for future play. Challenging white's pawn chain immediately opens dynamic play and aims for queenside counterplay. Clearing the central files now opens lines for your rooks to dominate the action. Opening that central pawn tension is a crucial step towards regaining piece activity and simplifying the ensuing middle game complexity. Developing the knight to e2 eyes the central squares, aiming to bolster the queenside pawn structure and prepare for a potential kingside castling advantage. Solidifying the queenside and preparing to develop the queenside bishop, while creating a slight weakness on c6. A timely castling secures the king, preparing for the central pawn push or potential queenside expansion. Confronting the doubled pawns head-on opens a tactical skirmish where piece activity becomes paramount. Reopening the c-file with this capture not only opens lines for your rook, but also creates immediate central pawn tension. Relocating the bishop to this aggressive diagonal directly pressures white's central pawn structure. Bolstering the king's defense while potentially preparing for a pawn thrust, this move subtly addresses potential future threats. A strategic pawn sacrifice, aiming to gain diagonal dominance and disrupt white's pawn structure, potentially opening lines for future attacks. Unlocking the queen's diagonal, white aims to exploit the weak dark squares created by black's bishop trade. Opening lines for the rook, eyeing potential infiltration or creating defensive pressure on the d-file. Redirecting the knight to a more active central square, eyeing the dark squares and preparing for further kingside expansion. Reasserting piece activity, black aims to challenge white's central pawn structure and pressure the d4 pawn. Fortifying the queenside structure after the doubled pawns is paramount. Injecting immediate queenside pressure, black boldly advances the h-pawn to disrupt white's pawn structure and create a dangerous outpost for the rook. Reinforcing the e4 square and preparing to challenge central influence feels like a proactive step. Daringly probing the kingside, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's harmonious piece placement and create a potential weakness. Unleashing a knight towards the kingside, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure and threaten the black monarch's safety. A daring knight sortie targets the kingside, creating immediate tactical complexities while potentially isolating itself. Exploiting the open d-file, white injects central dynamism, aiming to pry open black's kingside before the knight can effectively regroup. Unleashing the knight's potential, this move ignites tactical possibilities and threatens white's central pawn structure. Liberating the bishop allows for dynamic piece play and aims to exploit the kingside pawn push. Reasserting central pressure, this maneuver aims to unblock the d-file and prepare for a kingside push. Injecting dynamism, This thrust challenges black's central control and seeks to pry open the king's defenses, urgently reinforcing the queen's central position. This maneuver seeks to exploit the open e-file and disrupt white's developing harmony. Pushing pawns to the kingside aims to restrict black's pieces and gain space, but it weakens white's own king defense. Unleashing the queen to the center creates a dynamic pawn race, but exposes the king to future complications. Seeking to activate the rook and potentially contest the open f-file. Reasserting control of the central files, this rook swing prepares for an active role and potentially threatens the e-pawn. Consolidating rooks on the open file fortifies the king's defense and prepares for a potential central advance. Reinforcing the d-file allows black to begin accumulating influence and potentially prepare for a central pawn break. Guarding against black's encroaching knights, white aims to shore up the kingside before a potential pawn storm. This regrouping seeks to reinforce the knight and prepare a central pawn push. Sacrificing material for king's safety, white aims to disrupt black's queenside coordination and expose the monarch to potential discovered attacks. The knight's daring sortie creates immediate mating threats and forces white's pieces into a defensive scramble. Unleashing a pawn storm, white gambles on opening lines for his pieces while creating structural weaknesses. A bold sacrifice to disrupt white's central structure and seize initiative on the open files. Sacrificing material to rip open the king's sanctuary, inviting chaos. A desperate attempt to disrupt white's imposing king's flank, but it opens the path for a swift, decisive response. Unleashing a pawn sacrifice on f3, white aims to shatter black's defensive pawn shield and expose the enemy monarch. A crucial queen sacrifice that simplifies to a potentially winning endgame for black, aiming to exploit white's compromised pawn structure. This knight repositions to a more active central square, ready to support advances or exploit weaknesses. A bold pawn thrust aims to unleash the dark-squared bishop and seize central space. Repositioning the bishop to support the pawn advance and create attacking prospects on the queen side. Probing the open c-file is a sound idea now that the major pieces are off the board and the d-pawn can advance. This pawn grab immediately creates a king safety crisis by opening the center and abandoning pawn protection. Reclaiming the central file after the exchange offers better pawn structure and activity for the rooks. Finally securing the open d-file, white aims to activate their bishop on a better diagonal. The rook boldly ventures onto the third rank, probing for weaknesses along this crucial open corridor. Unlocking the king's escape route and preparing to contest the crucial central files for queenside pawn pressure. Relying on that rook sacrifice, you aim to disrupt the pawn chain and activate your trapped pieces. Asserting the open file with the rook aims to disrupt black's recently established defensive structure and create counterplay. Securing the king's safety from the encroaching rook is paramount, seeking to consolidate his forces. Asserting central influence, the knight redirects towards kingside action, seeking to exploit overextended pawns and a potentially exposed royal. Focusing on the newly opened g-file, this brings the rook to a more active square, eyeing potential breakthroughs or defending against white's piece activity. Asserting command over the central files offers white immediate counterplay against black's potentially loose pieces. Aggressively contesting the open files, black aims to disrupt white's centralized pieces and create counterplay. Squeezing the rook into the 7th rank now poses a direct threat, limiting black's options significantly. Initiating a pawn storm on the queenside aims to destabilize white's king's defenses. The rook lifts into the fray, aiming to exploit the open files and pressure the enemy king's defenses. Black's pawn advance to a4 aims to secure space and prevent white's rook from easily infiltrating the queenside. This pawn thrust aggressively advances, aiming to lock down black's queenside and potentially create an unstoppable passed pawn down the central files. Black aggressively advances the passed pawn, aiming to create unstoppable threats on the queenside and disrupt white's king's safety. A calculated risk, placing the bishop where it might fall prey to black's advancing pawn for temporary initiative. The passed pawn marches onward, a potent threat now entering the endgame's critical phase. Sacrificing the bishop for pawn clearance on the 7th rank unleashes a dangerous passed pawn.